As you want. So you can well, it's microphone works, so for that first step you can get the state.
If you want to stop the screen, just click on the the one with the stop option.
Ja, das ist das sehr konstigt.
A big audience today. The school. So you all speak English?
Yes.
That's good. That's good. So you will understand. So maybe one more.
Okay.
So do this.
Okay. And I think we are ready to start. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Buongiorno, everyone, and welcome. This is Magne Järve. My name is Helen Severlöken. I'm here chairing this session number 4. We would like to thank for the opportunity to come here today and to chair this session on rock art and landscape. Landscape is an important aspect of research. Okay. Landscape is an important aspect of rock art research. The fact that we can still observe and interpret images in its surrounding landscape is an important factor. The panel surface itself contains aspects that we are very much present when the rock art was made. So in this way, we can look at landscape from different levels and in different scales. So at macro level, we can see the rock art in the surrounding landscape and in relation to sea, river systems, outcrops, mountains, and such. And we also have a micro level with the panels microtopography, where we can look at cracks or clefts, curving, and orientation, and how the images are placed next to them. So the landscape can provide us with information and contextualize important elements. So in this session, we want to enlighten this aspect of rock art research and encourage you to present different ways of seeing rock art and landscape as an important and intertwined duality. So, starting at the larger scale, at the micro level. The landscape can be used to get information about how the rock art appeared in the landscape. To make distribution maps, it can show the rock art pattern in the landscape. And this is an example from a valley in central Norway. And you can see the rock art slides seem to be making some sort of regular distance between them. And it's connecting with the fertile land and settlements in the area.
Then go to the level of the locational level. I'm going to show you two examples from northern Europe. The top one is from a cliff with rock paintings in northern Finland, Valcamonica, and the bottom one is from Prehistoric in northwestern Russia, where you can see then at the cosmological level or landscape level, this is related to the location on the shore, where you have the overworld, the middle world, and the underworld in cosmology, and thereby the rock art is situated in this liminal area in the shore zone, which seems to be a high factor in the Stone Age rock art of northern Fenuscandia. And we also see, you have to move this, yeah. And if you then see this cliff, you can also see how the whole cliff is making out an anthropomorph. It's called the Sleeping Giant, and it has quite a lot of rock art in the middle area of the panel. The rock art is situated here, and if you look closely at the cliff, this was actually called the Sleeping Giant before the rock art was made. And you can actually see the forehead, the eye, the nose, and the mouth and the chin of the cliff. So actually the formation of the cliff makes out the face. And we find this on quite a lot of cliffs with rock art in Northern Europe.
Sorry. And these two examples can be looked from a cosmological view. These are painted elk figures from North Sweden and central Norway. And what you can see here is that I've painted them next to cracks in the rock surface. Perhaps this can be interpreted as cracks to another world, and that these figures was moving between the different worlds, perhaps passing through the membrane of the rock itself. Here's another example, and another aspect that could be important: the color of the rock. Or special qualities about the rock surface that could be important in understanding the rock art. This is also an example I will come back to in my presentation, but what we want you to look at here is the colors that perhaps give an idea of the aurora borealis or the northern lights of Norway.
And in the end, there you see how much the quality of the rock changes depending on the different times you visit the rock. If you look at how we present rock art, it's at the top left of the presentation. It's a bear mother with her bear cub walking, and if you see the photo under, that's a normal daylight. The photo to the upper right is taken 6:20 in the morning, quite early when you're up, and the bottom one is taken during the midnight sun in Norway. So you see how much the quality of the rock art sort of like pops out of the rock at different times and with different weather also then. But the light has quite a good meaning also on how you perceive the rock art and its landscape. From the bottom level all the way up to the top level. And with this brief introduction, we are happy to say that we have quite a good group of presenters, so we are looking forward to listening to them all. So thank you all for attending this session.
Okay, then I'm going to start with my presentation. And we are now introduced how looking at landscape at the macro and micro level can be important to understanding the context and meaning behind the rock art. So today I'm going to look at landscape from different levels, but also looking at other than human elements as different agents to understand the temporality and changeability of rock art. So rock art can come to light and vanish in front of our eyes. And this image from Leirfall in central Norway illustrates how moist surface and perfect light conditions give life to the rock art. This presentation today is based on an article which was published in March this year, and Astrid Nyland was the lead author of this article. And we wanted to look further into an area of research that we both find very fascinating, the temporality and changeability of rock art. So today I want to present and discuss some of our results from our collaboration. And I also have an article coming up, perhaps next month, I hope, which is dealing with related themes as well. So just to give you an idea on where we are, this is a map of the area which I will mention today. And it's particularly the site of Leirfall and Hammer in central Norway, and Wingen at the west coast of Norway, and Alta in the northern Norway, marked with red arrows here. So during this presentation, I want to show different agents that could be important for understanding the rock art. So this presentation will not focus on the meaning behind the motifs, what the image may represent. This presentation deals with the how, testing different agents that could be relevant for our understanding of how the images should be seen or could be seen. It's more like trying to hear the words than trying to understand them. So this is difficult to get a grip on, like catching sand, and it's even more difficult to document these aspects of rock art. But I think everyone who has worked with rock art knows about these elements. And it is important both in documentation work, research, and dissemination to try to get these aspects and see how we experience rock art. So I'm going to look at light, movement, and geology. And I think all these elements has to do with our perception and how we see things as a constructive process. And our perception connects with different senses like seeing, hearing, smelling, and touching. So, of the different agents we have looked at, the light is perhaps the most powerful agent of all. Obviously, without light, there is nothing. So, light could be seen as the giver of life. And we think also this applies to the rock art. And everyone who has worked with rock art documentation know how important the aspect of light is. This is a picture from central Norway, a beautiful panel with beautiful figures, but you cannot see it here because this picture is taken when it was very cloudy and the images are almost invisible. But in the right light, or with artificial light during dark, like we did yesterday, this comes to life. So you can see fish images representing halibuts that comes to life at certain times of the day. The shifting of light during the day from sunrise to sunset can be seen as an agent, but also the spring sun and the autumn sun gives different light to the images. So numerous scenes could almost be seen as playlists as the sun moves across the sky. And we need to perhaps take this into account also when interpreting the rock art. Can the shift of the light actually change the narrative? And the dome-shaped bedrock contributes to this effect. Another dome-shaped bedrock is found at Hammer in central Norway. This is the same panel, just seen from different angles. The southward view of the site, and B looking towards west. So this means that in order to see the images, there are several agents at work. Firstly, the light will shift during the day, traveling from east to west, and this will affect different sides of the panel at different times during the day. Another important agent is the observer itself, because you cannot see all the images at the same time. You have to move around the panel. So the shifting light makes observing a dynamic process, but adding the movement of the observer, the rock art panel is far from a static medium. So returning to the shifting of light, I will now focus on an example here within the red circle here. This is from a documentation done in 2018, which I attended. And what happened here was that we had really bad weather during the documentation work, so we had to work beneath tents. And this also was unfortunate because the light wasn't playing to our advantage. So actually we made a discovery after we came inside following the field work. We used MeshLab as software to recreate and manipulate the light in order to illuminate the scanned panel from different angles, which revealed a shifting of interpretation as well. If you can see the two images below here, number B, you can see a couple of ears here, so we interpret this as the elk figure. And when we shift the light, the ears disappeared and this line appeared. So we have a whale head. So the tracing and the rubbing footage reveals this aspect. You can see the whale head here marked with the red dots, and you have the ears here. And the joining of different images is something that we can see in many sites in Scandinavian rock art. particularly from the Stone Age period. So this isn't something new, but what is new that we actually could see this changing when we shift the light. And the effect of the shifting light angles affecting the way that how we interpret different animals scaffold us. And maybe this was something that was actually intended. So this example can illustrate a temporality, not only in time, but also in interpretation. From one moment, the elk is an active agent in a story or narrative. And after a while, the light shifts and the narrative changes and the whale takes over, perhaps, or vice versa. So the movement of the sun could change a specific image story, as shown in the previous example. However, the observer's own movement is also possible an active agent on how to understand the narrative as a dynamic process. What we were asking ourselves was if some panels should be understood as a narrative constantly changing and altering its story, according to which route you choose. This is an example from Wingen, where you can see some archaeologists visiting the site. I think perhaps you among them, yeah. And you can see this is a panel that you can walk in different directions, and it's a large surface. So will you change some of the meaning behind the motif simply by walking another direction? Or what happens if you add a new image to the panel? Most of the rock art panels in Norway shows a variation of style and type. And this could imply that the panel was made through a longer period by different people. So it's making it very hard to believe that the panel represents only one story, one general story or overall context. Then back to this example, colors of the rock and the type of rock could possibly also play an important part of the narrative, like this panel in Alta. This is a phenomenon that was previously been made known by researchers like Prehistoric. And in dry weather, the stone appears gray and purple, like you can see on this image. But when the surface gets wet, the colors changes into dark gray and blue and green. And it's very hard not to think of the northern lights when you see this image. And perhaps this was a quality that this panel was chosen for. And does this mean that the whole story was only available during the rain and when the surface was wet? Returning to the first slide and the site of Lightfall in central Norway, and to this fleet of boat figures from the Bronze Age period, you can see the large system of cracks to the left of the figure here. And during heavy rainfall, they will fill with water and make a stream and waves right next to the fleet. Another geological phenomenon is also apparent at Lightfall and was introduced by Kalle Sognes. Several square holes from eroded or removed periods, also known as fool's gold, can be seen covering the whole panel. When the light hits the panel, the rock may have come to life in another way and giving a shimmer to the panel. Of course, we cannot know this for certain, and today almost all the periods have weathered away, but small rusty holes are still visible throughout the whole panel. So, to conclude, sensorial explorations can often be seen as soft science or secondary or too subjective. Nevertheless, we find that new possibilities to document rock art sites and the recognition of varied sensorial perception and experiences are combined. It allows for exciting and new interpretations. The examples I have shown today emphasizes light and movement as actively transforming and influencing perception. While we cannot know who actually told the stories, whether one believed that it was the sun itself, or the rock, or the people experiencing the light show, the story clearly entails more than the images and the rock surface we can document. We have considered movement, light, and perception, and demonstrated the meaning of the figures and the stories were open, temporarily dynamic, and variable. The sites and motifs can be seen as fluid and dynamic and have hence performative power to shape and renew realities of the rock art's narrative. Thank you.
Hello, I'm now going to present a detailed interpretation of one of the newly discovered rock art sites in southern Norway. And it was found in 2018, and there is no rock art or rock paintings in this area before, so it was quite Steinberge, which translates to stone rock, of course, feature along the lake, and you can see it in this area here where the rock art is. This is where it is situated in southern Norway, and you can clearly see that there are no other clear rock outcrops on the side of the lake, and also here there is no place to place rock art from start because there are no cliffs in the area, which is would be a locational factor for this site at Steinberg. So here is the panels. There is one large panel here, and you can clearly see that it's straight from the sea. So to do field work here, you need a boat to get there, and also to document it is quite hard because you have to stay in the boat documenting. It's a small ledge of 0.5 meter close to the rock where you can stand. But if you then walk one step further back, it's 20 meters straight down. So health and safety is quite crucial when documenting the site. And I have been at this site then to document it, and during the fieldwork in 2019, found a second site here on this panel that was not known before. So now it consists of two panels then on this site. Here you see how it was when it was discovered in 2018. It's quite faint and it's hard to see the figures, and it was documented and reported to the press. They reported that you could see 7 figures with rock art, elk and a human figure. It had been known by a person with a boat that went past the area 15 years before, but he didn't really think it was something to report. But of course it was, and we are very happy that he did. So by documenting the site, this was made more like a research project. We didn't just go in to document it traditionally and get out the figures, but we experimented quite a lot with intensive photography. We used 4 different cameras, based from simple cameras to digital SLRs, to make then into Metashape and Agisoft models in photogrammetry. And we had a massive data collection for future modeling, so we can compare the difference on the site. So we also experimented with D-Stretch, but also comparing it with Photoshop, because people have been too focused on D-Stretch, forgetting the other tools. And sometimes you can get much more out with Photoshop than you can do with the filters built in with D-Stretch. So basically by digital enhancement, we got something like 78,000 photos with the different filters. And we went through them to see whether the different filters could give us different things. And on some of the figures in some of the areas, because of the erosion and the different quality of the rock, the discoloration by bats in the area that left traces on the rock, we also could get out more using different filters. So we would combine the filters in Photoshop in layers, and I haven't got time to show all of that, to try to see whether we can get more using it. And I will show you later also, it's been a test project also going out in different seasons. So I've been on all different seasons with different weather to see if it changes the quality and how much you can get out of the rock using the digital filters. So basically this is the 3 different stages of distance. We chose different distance to get different qualities out of the rock. I'm not going to show you all the levels because I think we use something like 15 levels to get there. But basically what you have here is this area, and then this area is then a more close-up view of this. And then you see the difference come out, and it's quite a lot more than what would be seen with the normal eye, just looking at the rock art side. So we got quite a lot of more, which everybody does using D-Stretch. It's not a magical tool, but it shows us much more. So this is basically the scales that we use then to go in and see how we can find more in the rock paintings then by the different digital enhancements. And then we found a total of 31 figures or figure remains on this outcrop, where you normally only see 7. The majority was elks, but there's also human representations. One figure that's been interpreted as a bear figure. There are quite a lot of these dots, which we also have interpreted as fingerprints. And there are a few lines, and of course the undefined figures where we don't see what they are. They are blurs, and we also see an area where they are just smudged, the whole area with red paint. There's nothing there, but it's just a smudged area with red paint. This is how it looks like when you apply D-Stretch then. And it's of course fantastic to see how the red color is appearing. We also did this modeling to fix the figures onto the site, so we can change and look at different features, 3D of course in the future, and compare and look at it and rotate it. But I'm not going to do this here digitally because it's bound to stop with this transmission of the digital conference. But at least this is how we then try to fixate it, so we know where the figures are and it's easy then to see where they are if you change the view of how the rock looks. And you can also look at the rock from different angles afterwards and then compare it when you go out of sight. So what we also found was superimposition, which is quite interesting. What is more interesting is that they are, as have been shown on other presentation on this conference, that they are not repainting the figures that was there before. They are making new figures on top. And if you look at this very clear figure here with the ears and the body, you can see that there is an elk figure under with the front leg here and the back leg here. Can you see the cursor on the screen? Yeah. And all of this panel has, well, 5 or 6 of the figures has eroded or almost disappeared figures underneath. Looking at the different discoloration is difficult because of the bat remains on the figure. But what I can see now, there is at least two, maybe 3 incidents or layers. But it's very hard to establish if there are 2 or 3 layers with rock paintings. But there's no way you can see this without de-stretch or digital enhancement. So I'm now going to go into why I think seasonality is quite important and why they are making the rock art the time of year they are, because I think it's as an archaeologist, we often go out and document things during summer because it's nice. That's when we go on fieldwork, and we document the sites when it's best to be there for us, Norway, which has been a tradition for at least the last 100 years. And this is how it looks like in this area, where the area of the rock art site I'm pointing out is here. You can see how much the landscape and the area is changing throughout the season. This is a whole year in 2004. Of course, it would be less snow now due to the melting, but still the seasonal change is happening every year. And this is how it looks like in November when you visit the site. And there is a frozen lake, you can see it beneath here. And you also have some snow appearing in the area, and the figures are in this area. And then you go there in September and you get this fantastic reflection in the sea, which can refer to the underworld, where you actually see a reflection of the rock, and the rock art image you actually mirror in the lake underneath. So it will be their world under the world where the rock art is part of the cosmological interaction there. And then you go there in March and you can see that the snow is covering, and it's very easy to access the site because you can walk on the snow or the ice. It's no problem getting there. So I'm going to get back to that. Just bear in mind, when did they really make the rock art? During winter, when you could walk there easily, or when you have to stand there in the boat trying to make it when the boat was wiggling. This is how it looks like in June, when it's very hard to see the rock art because the reflection and the shadows makes it hard to see the figures because they are partly covering, partly uncovering the rock art. So that's the 4 seasons I've been there so far to document the rock art and the changing in the temporality of this site. Then we started discovering these marks on the rock. And we don't live there, but we asked them, local people, why the boathouses were so high from the lake. And that has to do with the fluctuation. The fluctuation on this lake, and it has not been down. There's no change on this lake level since the Stone Age. So there has been no changes to the way the fluctuation has been in the lake from the Stone Age to today. And you can then see how this mark is quite clear on the rock. And this is remains from the pollen that go into the lake. And when it then dries out, you can see this horizontal line. And the only thing this would be is the level of where the lake is at different times of the year. And it leaves quite distinctive marks on the rock. Then we are extremely lucky at this lake because the Norwegian water power, agency, they wanted to build a power plant in the area, extracting the water from this to make electricity. And they've done on all the lakes further down in the lake system. But this top lake, they didn't do it because it wasn't economically viable, so they didn't do it. And that's fortunate for us because they put measuring systems in, so they can measure the height of the elevation of the lake every day in centimeter detail. So I've got data for the last 50 years on how much the lake has fluctuated. So I got that out, and you could see then that the lake is fluctuating from March 1980, it was 721.14 meters above sea level, while the highest level in June 1995 was 722.95 meters, which is then 1.8 meters difference. So if you go back to the lake and see that the fluctuating water is then 1.8 meters, this is a meter scale, you can see that what then comes out is that the rock art would have been covered by water at least 2 times during this 40 or 50 year period. So to visualize this, I put the lowest figure line here, there, and you can see then that the lowest part of the figure is losing, or the legs are not there. Most likely that is because just after they made the rock art, the water level rose, and it would actually take away the figures. And then you would question, that could just be an incident on this one. But the fantastic bit is that this is more than a meter apart, and the bottom of this human figure is also gone. You can see the faint remains of it just under the line, and the bottom of this elk figure is also gone, and part of a figure here is also gone just under the same line. And when you then raise it to the level it was in June, you could see that most likely then all of this area here with rock art was covered with the lake, trying to erode the rock art. This would explain the superimposition where some of the figures were actually washed away by the rising water level in the lake, and then they made new figures. And we have no idea how many times they have done this, but we can see 2 to 3 incidents when they've done this, and we know by the data that it happens. The lake raises about up to this level 2 times every 50 years from the data we have now. And if you go back to this presentation, you also see that they are calculating how high it would reach at the extreme water levels when you have a heavy snow melting, and when all the area is filling up in the lake. They estimate that what they would then demand to be a 100-year flood would be up to 724 meters, which would then cover the area up to this line here. This would be then 1 meter above this, so you would be up there with water. That would be all of the rock art would be covered with water, with all the implications for the conservation, the protection of the site. This is quite crucial for maintaining and monitoring the site. So the consequences here for research is that the data acquisition and relations to the seasons in prehistory, we have to account for this when we are documenting the rock art. We have to look at the sites with interpretation, be very careful and document them very carefully when it comes to de-stretch, and do a lot of photography to try to get out these information from the rock art. And we also see that the rock paintings have a clear relation to the shore, and the lake or sea level is important, which I see for most of the Stone Age rock art in Fenuscandia. It also have large complications for the cultural research management. And the challenges related to protection, conservation, and maintenance of the site is quite large. And this will be initiating further damages to the site because of the fluctuation. We know that it will damage quite a lot of the site in the future. And that's why also at these sites, we need to document them extremely over and over again like this to be sure that we have it. Because if the ice is there when the lake is rising, it will actually damage the whole site. So when should we go and look at the rock art? This is when we got there during winter, walking with skis, coming to the site. Site is beautifully standing out here, and it's easy accessible. You can just walk there. You get there, you can see the images quite clearly. This is in March. So I think this should be put out with dissemination, where you have people facilitating them there during winter. Because if you guide them there during summer, they will guarantee go to have hard access to the place, and I think quite a few will get the boat onto the rock art site, damaging the rock So is this only at Steinberget in southern Norway? No, when we look at this in Skärvangen in northern Sweden, when I was there walking on skis, this area, I've also been there during summer. I didn't bring all of those photos in because it would be too much. But at Skärvangen in northern Sweden, you can also see walking to the site during winter is quite easy and it's easy accessible. And also here along the site, you can see there's lots of boulders here. So to go there with a boat is almost impossible during summer because you can't approach the site with boat because the boulders are stopping you. The river in northern Sweden at Duve, you can see how the snow is making the rock art come out. This was how it was when I got to the site. Varikalu in northern Finland is the same thing. And the interesting thing is there is no fluctuation of the water level. It's stable throughout the year. But some of the rock art is made 3 meters up the cliff. So how did they do that? Were they 3 meter large, making the rock art? I don't think so. I think they were made during winter time. They were also used during summertime, I think. But the whole thing is that if you build this area up with snow, you would stand there and make the rock art 3 meters up the cliff. People have suggested they have been hanging outside the cliff with a rope, making the rock art. I guess it's more easy going there during winter. Same thing is at Steinberget at the far right here. We had a lot of health and safety measurements documenting this site during November because it was only 4 centimeters ice, so it was quite dangerous to walk there. So we had to walk on a rubber fleet and stand on that one and on a ladder so we wouldn't have the pressure on one person standing. The problem is when you fall, and this rose here in the ice is from me falling and dropping onto the ice. So 4 centimeters can keep up 110 kilos falling on the ice, which is quite fascinating on how much the ice is bearing when it comes to weight. This Snowscapes of Rock Art is recently published in publication edited by me and Mari Hansen in Equinox. So you can find it there where I'm looking into the winter aspects and the snowscapes of rock art. So if we then look at the hunter-gatherer rock art of Fenuscandia, this is the distribution map of all the roughly 300 sites that was known when I did my PhD in 2010. Quite a few new site has come out, but I haven't updated the map yet. This is the new site in Steinberget. You can see here the de-stretch version on it and the original. And if you look at the rock carving sites close by, you can see that there is one motif dominating the whole area, and it's the elk motif. So you have Steinberget with the paintings, you got Doffløy here, Møllerstufossen, Stein, Glemmestad down here, Eidefoss and Drotten, and all of them has a major focus on the elk and the elk figures. And if we go back to Steinberget, we can see all of these areas here, which is quite prominent in this area lower here. This is elk hunting pits or elk hunting systems from history. We can, of course, not date them to the exact time of the rock art site, which is here. But if we look at the distribution, what's defined as the elk hunting facilities, all of these green dots are the elk hunting facilities, and it's spread out in the whole area. So it's a massive area of elk hunting called the elk land in the local community area. And they also have signs naming this as the elk land. Then we talked to the local inhabitants and we got information on where the elks are walking in the area, especially then at this time. And this would be the same in prehistory because these mountains here would hinder them walking along this area. And they would prefer to walk along the lake. So you see the stippled line are the ones we are not 100% sure of. But here is where the elk is moving and it's walking straight past the site of the rock paintings. And we are also so lucky that we have a local informer that helps us with photos. So this is the rock painting site. And here you can see the elk has been walking past the site with the elk track here. And this is the rock art panel and the elk droppings. The other thing is that when you try to document this, when you don't live in the area, it's very problematic. When we were there in March, we walked there and the wind was so heavy that after 20 minutes, our tracks were covered with snow, so we couldn't see them. But we are lucky here to have a local informer that sends us photos on how the situation are, at least here during winter, so we were very happy about it. Close by, just about 50 meters from the rock art site, we found a chert or quartzite then, but we cannot be 100% sure that this has been used, but we find the same thing in settlements not far from this. But we cannot be sure that it's extracted because there is modern extraction of rock in the area. But the quality of the material is fantastic, and it's very similar by visual checking that it's the same. And we are trying to check it towards one of the excavations that's been in the neighbor area when they built the water plants to see if it is the same quality of the rock with XRF, but we haven't got there yet. So concluding remarks will be that this is the first site. It's fantastic that it's found. The initial studies showed that it was about 7 figures. Using extreme digital documentation, we got out 34 figure remains. And it's important to document the seasons of rock art according to accessibility and the temporality of the site, which shows that it's likely then that rock art was used in all seasons and maybe also made during winter time. The raw material site, of course, we cannot be sure that it's used, but it's quite likely. And as you have seen, the fluctuation makes large consequences for the research. Normally people would go to a site once and then they have documented it. So this is an experiment research-wise to try to look at the site over and over and over again and see if we can get more out of the site. And it has consequences for cultural research managements where they are very reluctant to making it available to the public. But if you do it during winter time, it will be easy accessible. And as part of that, the dissemination has to be seasonal. We have to show it at the winter time to people coming there. So this is just a broad version of how to do field work in this area with the different seasons. I should have had a shorts on the left one, but still, it's quite challenging going to these places during winter sometimes, and you have to go on skis for quite a few kilometers before you get there. I must say in the end that I'm very happy to have Henriette Aasen at Innlandet County Municipality with me on this presentation. She's been part of the documentation from day one and was the one that hired me in to do the documentation of the site. So I would like to thank her, and I would also like to thank all the people that attended this session, both here in Valcamonica and digital. So thank you. Yeah. Then next we have Anne Åsmundstad Sommervold, which is going to present next here in presence.
Hello. My contribution today is based on my master thesis, which I finished in May this year. So this is my first conference ever, first time doing this. So my thesis was based on a particular phenomenon in rock art, where the rock art can be considered as hidden. And what this might say about the intended recipient of the rock art.
It's quite interesting that the rock art is placed where it is not easily seen, when the rock art is a very visual thing. So I've called this hidden messages, rock art in special landscapes in central Norway. By hidden, I mean that it is in contrast to open rock art sites where large groups of people can gather, or that it's been hidden on purpose, for example, in graves or in caves, or that it's concealed by water, or rock art in places that are just physically or psychologically restricted. And I decided to look at rock art in 3 different contexts where this phenomenon occurs. And these were grave contexts, cave contexts, and contexts connected to travel routes. And I wanted to have several contexts in order to illustrate the variation of this phenomenon. So I researched 7 sites in central Norway. As you can see on the map, I forgot to put the names on, but you can see the distribution here. And I decided to have a phenomenological approach combined with landscape analysis. And I used this to structure these landscapes where the rock art is placed, and to have a multisensory perspective on the rock art and in its landscape, soft science, like Edwin said. And from this, I tried to interpret if this could give a clue as to whom the rock art is intended. So these are my grave contexts, my grave sites. You have Prehistoric and Steiner. And these are Bronze Age burial cairns. These graves contain decorated slabs in the grave chamber. And both of these cairns were placed sort of nestled in the landscape. As you can see from the viewshed analysis, it didn't have much view from land, but had plenty of view to the sea. And they are very clearly meant to be seen from the water, not from land. I don't have pictures of the cairns because they were destroyed long ago, but these are the fragments from the decorated slabs. And this rock art is quite the opposite of open air rock art, because this rock art has been inside and private for the dead. And it is on the earth and not turned up to the sky. As the rock art cannot be seen by the living, it is clear that it is intended as a communication with the dead. And a grave chamber is in stark contrast to the living world, as it lacks light and sound and such things. And there's the caves. I had 2 caves, the Solsiden cave and the Fingal cave. Both have very inaccessible entrances, in the sense that they are very physically restricted with very steep entrances. But caves are also very psychologically restricted, because entering a cave, especially if you don't have proper light, it demands some courage and willpower. And the paintings that are found in the caves, and in all the painted caves along the coast of Norway, are uniform human figures. And in total there are 21 in the Solsen Cave, and 48 in the Fenno Cave. And the paintings are placed in the breaking between light and dark, or in the inner and darkest parts of the caves. And this placement of the paintings in the darkness and in restricted parts of the caves make them quite hidden as rock art. And again, it indicates that the rock art was perhaps not meant to be seen by other humans. And then my travel contexts. I have 3 sites there. So the first one is Hornhammer on the picture there, where there are several panels with rock paintings. Some of them are placed on steep cliff walls that plummet into the fjord below. And these are available from water, but not from land. A lot like Steinberg, which I want to just talk about. And then we have the second one, Symposium, where there's a number of carvings, in particular footprints, found on boulders along the shoreline. And these stones are flooded most of the year, and they're only above water and available for a small period of time in spring. And the last one, the Böla site, and then in particular the Böla layer, as you can see there. This one is situated in a waterfall, so that it looks like that the rain is coming out of the waterfall. And also here during periods of heavy rain or melting snow, the waterfall can actually flood the site. So, very different sites, but there are some things that these hidden rock art sites have in common. For instance, the cave contexts and the travel contexts can be said to be dangerous. Caves may collapse, and you have to climb and crawl, and there are a lot of things there. And then there's the absence of light and the unknown of what might be at the end of the cave. So there are, like I said, there are both physical and psychological obstacles in a cave. The travel contexts are also in dangerous landscapes if we consider the cliffs and the high flow of water, and even the noise from the waterfall. And these trying landscapes have actively been sought out by these people. These landscapes that demand more from us as humans. And maybe that's the power in the rock art, that you have to overcome trials in order to maybe be able to communicate with some form of power, spirits, and beings. And then there's the influence of water and also of sound. This is the Böla site when it's flooded. Several of the sites that I researched are connected to water, and in the cases of Säbystrand with the flooding and Böla with the waterfall, it might be that someone has tried to communicate with something beyond the water. It's also worth mentioning how water is used to mix the paint used in rock paintings, like at Hornhammer and in the caves. Like in the caves, they might have used drip water, and that this might have been considered extra powerful, and that it works as a sort of solvent between the fingers and the rock to reach into the rock and the spirits within the rock. But sound also plays a part in how we experience the place, and if there is enough noise, it can surround us completely, and a lot of noise drains our energy. And this can be said for example, the Berlin site, where there is so much noise when you're standing right next to the reindeer, that you can't actually speak to one another, you can't hear one another. So just like water being like a liminal zone, sound can create liminal zones as well. So the common feature for all the sites that I looked at is that they are all placed at transitional places in the landscape, at liminal places in the landscape. The grave cairns have been in the transition between land and water, but obviously also between life and death. And the caves they make up separate rooms within the landscape, and they represent a different world from the human world. It's a stark contrast to the living world, entering the cave where there's no light, no sound. And then you have the travel contexts that are connected to water, and then the water sort of is able to take the rock art away, or that the water is the only way to reach the rock art. And these liminal zones have been interpreted as especially powerful places to communicate with other humans. So I'm going to conclude already. Special qualities of a landscape contribute to possible meetings between natural and supernatural, or the profane or the sacred. Elements that activate other senses other than the visual of the landscape and rock art are contributing factors in the interpretation of the rock art. And sensory elements can ground the distinctions between the human world and the worlds beyond. The psyche can also be equally tested at certain sites. And this phenomenological approach and the landscape analysis, they gave more layers to the interpretation of the rock art and may bring us closer to its creators, because we're all humans. And the hidden rock art phenomenon is not exclusive to Norway, and there are a lot of examples throughout the world of this, what I call hidden rock art. And keeping a multisensory perspective on the rock art and the landscape gives them more layers and more depth when we're interpreting that. Grazie.
Next speaker is Wenche Druhl. She's also in presence here in Valcamonica.
Buongiorno tutti. Hello, everyone. Thanks for to the managers or the organizers that are arranging this conference and allowing us, at least some of us, to be here in person. Thank you. It is perfect. I am Wenche Dun. I'm working at the Museum of Archaeology at the University of Stavanger in Norway. And we are managing the rock art in our museum region. I will also thank our session leaders, Jan Magne and Heidrun. They have illustrated how landscape reflects both cosmology as well as reality, from a small micro to a larger macro level. And their work are inspiring and are very complete. But combining the practical and functionalistic qualities of coastal landscapes with a more theoretical and maybe a cosmological and spiritual dimension could be challenging. Variations of rock art all over the world expresses different aspects of life, practical and mythical, simple and complex. Throughout Scandinavia, figurative motifs appear close to sea, separated from settlement areas. There is a dominance of ship motif in relation to water, and traditionally rock carvings are interpreted within the framework of European Bronze Age culture. But my focus will be more local, as I look at a cluster of open-air rock art sites in West Norway, in this area, where both motifs and location emphasize the narrative. You can't call it a landscape/seascape analysis in order to discuss the placement and the use of the sites. I will talk more about places and sites than chronology and motifs and periods. But just to set the chronological framework, the carvings, or the main amount of the carvings, are created between 2000 BC and up to 500 BC. And here you can see two well-used ship typologies and chronologies. The more local one to the left, which is developed in my focus area, and the more general to the right. But regarding these typologies, I think we have to consider that the meaning of the sites probably stretches beyond and prior to the making of the carvings. And now I will take you to a fjord system at the west coast of Norway. Here the rock art is located in maritime surroundings, islands, straits and inlets, small tongues and stripes of land where the fjords separate the mainland from the open North Sea. The coastline is not very welcoming, neither south nor north of this fjord system, with only a few places alike, with wind affecting open waters from all directions, disturbance by currents and waves, and seasonal variability. Crossing by boat must have been challenging. The yellow triangles, I hope you managed to see them. They are represented open air rock sites and panels. Some are more than one and some are just one. Some are gathered quite close together. And coming from south, the first chapter, harbors, appears where we meet the first of several open air rock sites along the shoreline in this area. Continue to the north and entering this fjord system, the sites are regularly distributed, and all are implying some dynamics between the sites and the coastline. And I hope to illustrate that, considering changes in the topography and ignoring modern disturbance and vegetation, the open air rock art sites in this area seem to have been part of a seascape where most of the places were in visual contact with or in immediate proximity to the ocean. And as a result of a modest regional land uplift in this area, the more than 20 sites are still situated roughly in their original topographic context with maritime surroundings. So we don't have to look for the lost sea in this area. And this is a factor that might make the relationship between the rock carvings, the coast, and the landscape somehow clearer for us today. So by using maritime glasses, we might extend the established idea of the rock art in this particular area as representations of agriculture and sedentary farmers. And in addition, I hope to illustrate that these farmers also were part of a mobile and maritime-oriented population. For people like me, born and raised by the coast where the seascape always has been superior to the landscape, it is easy to recognize the importance of the sea. The band of habitable land are so small compared to the infinite territory of the Norwegian Sea beyond reach. And even though in archaeology we focus mainly on past land life and material culture, the people have been inhabitants of the seascapes as much as the landscapes. 80% of the open air rock art sites in our museum region are concentrated to this fjord system. Now and then, new localities, motifs, or figures are added, but rarely or never additional empirical material in relation to the rock art. So discussing prehistoric use of seascapes are challenging as we lack the material culture. But the significance, the role, and the influence of the sea on past cultural activity seems more or less untraceable. Or maybe not. Considering different uses of the landscape and the seascape, as well as the relation between the open air rock art sites, might be a way into this. The rock carvings in our region have traditionally been documented in a micro perspective, motif by motif, figure by figure, and more rarely in relation to the rock surface or as being part of the landscape and the surrounding environment. Now we are doing the documentation both in a smaller and a broader perspective, like using 3D scanner and drones. Visiting the panels regularly and being able to experience, observe, and approach the open air rock art sites, both from the sea and land, underlines the assumption that these were made to be exposed and accessible and approachable from the sea. On the micro level, the great significance of water is strikingly immediated during or after heavy rain, harsh weather, and dramatic waves. And it is a good exercise observing the fjords throughout the year during all kinds of weather, from a peaceful seascape, calm and attractive, changing to dramatic, intense, dangerous, and even terrifying. The impact of weather and winds, pressure, moon and lunar phases attach the sea great significance, power and meaning, also beyond being just a wet element. A cosmological meaning that is hard to catch within a Western and modern framework. On a micro level, the topography by the panels is characterized by attributes like boulders, pebbles and gravels, shell and sand. And the tidal water exposes areas during low water and covers by high tide, leaving a distinct belt and own universe where the elements of the sea, land, and sky meet. It is tempting to assume that these open-air rock art sites had a specific role within American practice, but the specific meaning is lost for us, and it was probably multiple, emphasizing erasing or reducing the border between land and sea, representing meeting places, places for promoting cosmologies or ritual practice. Was it part of a larger network or a route system along the waterways? In a broader landscape context, some formations give association to the form of sea mammals like whales or spectacular creatures, or associations to formations like portals or gates to other worlds. The sites have been visible from the sea. The motifs are picturing maritime elements, like ships and fish, but also other motifs. And some of the figures are really deep. They have really deep lines, maybe simply showing us that it has been kind of repetitive action. It is probable that the coastal zone, places important for navigation and sailing, were also places where people gathered for arrival and departure ceremonies, celebrations and rituals. All the sites are situated either close to the shoreline or with a magnificent view to the fjords, the shipping lane and waterways. I will mention specifically the island of Åme, with more than 15 open-air rock art sites cover 1.5 kilometers of the coastline. All the known figures and motifs from the whole museum region are represented here. Human, animals, axes, footprints, geometrical figures, sun and circle motifs, to mention some. But the absolutely dominating motif is the ship, the boat, or canoe. One of the sites picture the largest boat carving found so far in Norway, almost 6 meters long. It is really difficult to get a nice image or picture of it today because it's surrounding and almost hidden in a forest. Narrow sounds and straits imply safer landings for boats and ships, and such places offer shelter at windy or harsh weather. All open-air rock art sites are located at accessible places suitable for both departure and arrival, as well as all kinds of a gathering. And the distribution of the sites, combined with our knowledge of the past landscape, make it clear that these were meant to be visible. Here you can see field 1, field 2, and field 3. And you see they are really visible, the sites from the sea. And then it continues in the same direction, 15 fields discovered so far, and they are probably even more under the sea. It is that this island possessed a core role in a larger maritime infrastructure, whatever kind of activities performed. Was it gatherings, celebrations, ceremonies, boat building, traveling in general for short or long distances? It is hard to know the purpose, but the location is surely strategic within a maritime framework. And even though the location, and even though this strategic location is significant, you could ask if the carvings strengthen this significance even further. And what associates a place through time? Can the maritime placing of the panels indicate certain meaning, intention, or interaction between humans and sites and places? The meanings of a place are formed by the nature of the place and human interaction, experience, and practice. All sites in my area corresponds with well-known natural harbors as well as sailing routes. And if they are not in immediate proximity to harbors, they get excellent outlook of the waterways in all directions. The Norwegian Pilots is a publication with a long history of 700 years. It is published by the Norwegian Hydrographic Service, and it describes fairways, channels, safe landing places, recommended natural harbors, destinations, and anchorage areas, in addition to information on wind and tidal currents. And even though the sea level differs from today with some meters, what is referred to as good harbors in this publication corresponds very well with where the rock art sites are placed. Knowledge about landfalls and land siting as mountains and heights used as cross-bearing points for sailing passages, combined with knowledge about dangerous sea areas and currents, was surely important knowledge of the sea pilot tradition. In my area of research, there have always been close relationship between humans and the sea. The coast beholds the role as a structuring element for the people living here, a place with another rhythm and different resources compared to the inland. But the coastal environment also varies between regions as well as through seasons, as Jan showed us. The coastline and the littoral zone for the practical function, but there are also more spiritual elements to be considered. Ethnographical studies like the Digo culture in Tanzania, the saltwater people in Australia, the Haida in North America, or the Sami culture in Fenuscandia, all have parts of a more spiritual cosmology worth looking into when I will continue this work in the future. Comparative approaches can be helpful, certainly in studying activities lacking material traces. Shamanistic culture will perform rituals to manage the hunting, the fishing, and the elements. The need for controlling tidal waters, waves, wind, marine context, landscape, and universes was fundamental. And I will just briefly mention the Sami concept of Saibo, relating to the to the underworld, a world under bedrock, under mountains, or even oceans, where the dead souls stay. And power animals are often associated with sacred animals with great power, like a bear with human attributes. And among the carvings at Olme, a bear print, or some possible bear prints, appears among the more traditional footprints. Also, sea mammals are seen as a research, with spiritual and mythological qualities, like entering the shape of a whale to reach the other world. And seals, on the other hand, lives in both the elements of land and water. So throughout periods of time, beliefs and superstition relate to rock art and mountains. Mountains often have their own folk tale, explaining how the living giants became paralyzed into today's mountain. And the materiality of rock and the supernatural power of solid rock have been discussed by several. And also the tool or the person associated with rock art production might have mythological and religious importance related to transformative power and the ability to create images. And for the people along the coastline, changes in sea level due to the isostatic rebound might have been sorry. I've been talking so much today. Might have been noticeable. When the sea level changes, islands were growing. There were flooded rocks and boulders came to view. And climatical variations and changes in temperature and humidity affected both flora and fauna and caused seasonal changes. So, the open air rock art sites in this area have several qualities. As I have been showing you, built harbors and characteristics of the rock, like a portal to another realm or to the underworld, but also characteristics of the rock surface, as you see here. Quartzite grains give associations to waves. And then afterward, do not forget all. Do not forget all elements inaccessible, like smells, sounds, or rhythm. But to sum up, a maritime turn together with new technology might broaden our interpretation or introduce new dimensions to previous understandings. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for staying for the debate. We open up now for questions to the four speakers. And we also have the chat open, so if anybody online wants to ask a question, they can write it on the chat. So we now open up for questions to all four speakers. Andrew.
Yeah. My question is for Jan Magne.
Yes.
In regards to the fact, the idea that you said that the paintings were probably made in winter, but I'm not sure. I mean, I have an idea because they reach the site when the lake is frozen, right? But the paint was liquid. Did you try to apply to a similar rock, maybe cold or frozen, a liquid paint in winter? It will work or not?
We have not tried to apply. We have not done experiments, right? But the ochre will be soft when you keep it on the body because it would not be extremely dripping liquid. And also when you get to the site like this during winter, when the sun is up, the rock is extremely hot and touching it, you will get heat. So I'm quite sure that.
But you should try.
We should try. Yes, you're right. Yes, we should try. Yes.
But the other paint, so all the paintings are liquid or crayon sometimes?
It looks like there have not been experiments on it. There has been no tests on it, but it looks like it's applied. Like what we did on an excavation a few years ago, we found red ochre like in lumps where we found it.
On the side?
On the side, on the settlement site. This is 2001. And what I did then was to take a small part of that and place it in the shore zone to see if it was there. And 3 weeks later, it was still on the shore zone close to the sea. So that was not during winter, but it shows that so close to the sea, when you have sea spray, it would still stay.
But the water of the lake is not salty?
No, this is fresh water.
This is fresh water?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but there should be some experiment, but to take samples on it, then you also need to do damage to the rock painting.
I mean, but you can,
yeah, you can
put a slab nearby, leave it there for the winter, and then in winter time, go there and try to.
Yeah, I agree with you. We should test it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. This is a question for you, Hedon. Thank you very much for a presentation and some fantastic examples of changes in temporality. But what I would like to ask you is to what extent do you think that all of your examples is something that were considerate, that people planned when they made it, or to what extent is it something that actually evolves afterwards? So to what extent is it part of the production, or something that becomes an important part later?
Thank you, Jonathan. Good question. A very good question. My answer is I'm not sure, but I think when we get this experience, when we are visiting the sites and suddenly we are at the right moment and we have this epiphany and the rock art comes to life, then I'm convinced that it's not by accident. But of course, we cannot say that it is for sure. Maybe this is something that was not intended. It could be, but I think perhaps, like the example with the modern lines, I think that quality was something that is so clear under the colors. It's such a beautiful rock in itself. And I think that adds to the meaning of the panel. But of course, with the elk that I showed the example, I'm not sure if it's the light agent is the main agent here. It could also be just a whale with ears, so we have the double, the dualism of the two symbols. But when we saw it afterwards with the changing lights, perhaps it was intended, but I can't give you a good answer in it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? Anybody at home?
Okay, then we thank you for attending, and we will now have a short break, and we will resume at 11. Oh, we have a question. Sorry. Yes. Okay, we don't have a question. We will resume at 11 with the next talk by Charlotte Dam, and continue until 12 o'clock when we have a debate. So now everyone can get coffee, tea, and biscotti. Good, very good. Sorry, I didn't interact so much with the request because this is complex stuff. But it's good to see that quite a few of these don't have. This is, I think it's very good for so many here. We need to get the rooms. Yeah.
So someone will share the screen. Tim Conrad.
Yes, I've got the video. My colleague has got the video.
Okay. So we don't have to put it in here.
No.
Okay, yeah, understand.
Jeg satt med dere. Okay.
Vi gjør det, så vi gjør ingenting om vi begynner. Min handsekk, det er jo ikke noe. Den der flytter på meg.
Jeg håper jeg.
Ja.
Okay, I think we are ready again now. Starting up after a coffee break. Then next we have Charlotte Dahm, who is going to talk about downscaling cosmological landscape from early to mid 20th rock art in northern Norway.
Thank you, Heidrun. This is a joint presentation also with Jan Magne Gjerde, who you heard earlier this morning. I would like to just start, as several others, to thank the organizers. Also thank them for organizing this as a hybrid event. I think we feel really privileged that we're able to be here in Valcamonica, physically present, so that we also able to see some of the fantastic rock art in the area and to see the landscape here. So again, thank you very much for that. This presentation then is focusing on the rock art in northern Norway. And in Norway, there are several different rock art traditions. There is a lot of rock art associated with foragers, that is, with hunter-gatherers. There's also rock art associated, more associated with later periods, as Bengt was talking about this morning. This presentation is going to focus on the early hunter-gatherer rock art, and it's going to focus on northern Norway. As Jan Magne showed this morning, there are very many forager rock art sites all over Scandinavia. And this presentation will focus on the northernmost part of Norway. In this region, again, there are several traditions, and I'm going to look at the differences between the early Holocene rock art and the later mid-Holocene rock art, and ask why are there such major differences in the way that these two rock art traditions are presented. So if we start with the early Holocene rock art, what is characteristic of the images here at this, their life size, so they're really large images, they're very naturalistic, and they're nearly all animal motifs. So some of the typical motifs that you would see are the reindeer, the elk, and the bear. So the three motifs that you see in these images on this first slide. We can also see that very many of the motifs, the sites are located on nearly vertical or perhaps sloping bare rock surfaces. And in many cases, there were just a few figures on each of these surfaces. This particular site here, Lakeness, is one of the larger sites. You see there's quite a large number of motifs here. You also see that the majority of the motifs are again elk, reindeer, bears, and a few other motifs, such as, for instance, a large orca that is presented here. And I have an image here of this orca, so a killer whale that's actually presented in this rock art. And this image is more than 7 meters long. So we really are talking about life-size images that we find on these sites. You also see in this image just how that the surface are actually sloping quite a bit here. So the images that we have is large animals, elk, reindeer, bear. There are also some birds, and there is actually the one orca, and there is one boat that has recently been published by Valcamonica. And again, this boat is also probably close to life size. It is more than 4 meters long. Yes. The only way that we can date this rock art is really by shoreline dating. I'm not going to talk about that method for dating, but it seems very consistent in northern Norway. And using that method, we can see that this rock art dates from about 9,000 up to about 4,000 calibrated years BC. And again, one has to bear in mind that since all of the Scandinavian peninsula was actually covered by ice during the last ice age, this means that some of this rock art is perhaps produced just a few hundred years after the very first people arrived in this area. So some of the earliest panels here are made by a pioneer colonizing population to the area. In the later period, in the mid-Holocene, we see a very different style of rock art. So we have smaller, schematized motifs, much more similar to what you might find here at Valcamonica, in fact. So again, there's a variety of motifs. Some of the very prominent ones, certainly some of the early periods, are again the elk, as you see here, the reindeer, and the bear. But you can also see that even though you can easily identify what animal we're talking about, they're not the same sort of naturalistic. They are more schematized. I apologize for not having, what do you call it? Anyway, so you can't see the size over here, but most of the motifs are perhaps between 10 to 20 centimeters. The elk just about here is probably somewhat larger, maybe up to between 30 and 40 centimeters. But again, they're nowhere like life-size images. What is also characteristic at some of these sites is that there is sometimes an immense complexity and variation in the images that we find here. So these are 2 examples from the UNESCO heritage sites at Alta in northern Norway, which some of you have probably heard about, where you can see many different motifs. You can see there are complex scenes, a variety of images that are presented in this mid-Holocene rock art. We can also see that there's some difference, some change in the type of landscape locations where the rock art is located. So first of all, while there may still be some sloping rock surfaces, they're often much more near horizontal. So rather than being almost vertical, they're much more near horizontal surfaces where we have the rock art. And in a number of places, the rock art is located on boulders, which is actually often located in the immediate vicinity of also settlement sites. So it's sort of at the settlement where people are living. So again, as I've already said, what characterizes this mid-Holocene rock art is that there's a diversity of motifs. There's also humans, dogs, lots of boats we have here, the geometric motifs, some artifacts, etc. And we have these composite scenes where you see hunting and fishing scenes, scenes that probably represent rituals, seasonal cycles, and possibly also mythical narratives. And again, by shoreline dating, we can see that some of the first images in this tradition starts from just before 5000 BC and continues until just before BC. So again, there is a slight overlap between these two traditions that we have here, but generally there is an older one and a later tradition. Okay, so the overall question is, why are these two traditions so different? And we're going to discuss this by looking at demography and mobility in northern Norway in these two different periods. So again, if we look at the first period in the early Holocene, the other archaeological material demonstrates that we are talking about a very small and scattered population over several millennia. Again, bear in mind that this was the first time that people ever settled in this region. It takes quite a long time for people to really grow to a larger population here. We are also talking about an early period where there's a lot of climate fluctuations. We can see that the dwellings, the houses that people were living in were probably very light ones. They were probably more like tents. We have an image here from North America, giving some ethnographic suggestions as to what some of these dwellings might have looked like. So very light dwellings. We can see that the resources were fluctuating because the climate was fluctuating. Then there was some instability in resources and the amount of resources. We can see that there are material and technological similarities over very large regions. So we'll find very much the same types of artifacts and tool types all along the coast of Norway. And in fact, we have this one case, which I'm trying to illustrate in the map here, where we can see that a new technology using for blade production using pressure technique is introduced all the way down from Karelia and Russia, then traveling up through northern Scandinavia and down again to southern Norway. And we have very good dates for this, suggesting that this technology was actually transferred in the course of maybe just a few generations. Again, suggesting that people were moving over long distances and quite rapidly. So again, all this information suggests that that people were actually being very mobile, that they were moving around a lot. They had short-term settlements. They were moving a lot, and they were moving long distances in this area. And if we look now at where the early Holocene rock art is located, we can see that it is very often associated with quite spectacular landscapes. Now, ethnographic examples of hunter-gatherers moving into new and unknown territory suggest that to find their ways and to explain to us how to find their way, that wayfinding is very often based on very prominent natural landscape features. And we see precisely, as you can see here, it's sort of a very large, spectacular landscape. It's easy to point out that you have to think of a mountaintop that is, this shape and this size. So it's easy to describe this kind of landscape. And it is precisely in this landscape that we found some of these very early rock art locations. So such prominent features would have been sort of anchor points in the landscape and crucial to the wayfinding. We also know that in hunter-gatherer communities, wayfinding is nearly always linked to narratives. These could be cosmological narratives, but they could also be experiences that people have been making. So people are telling stories, and that is how they remember to find the way. It's easier to remember something that you're being told in a story, in a narrative. So this was probably a first phase, and then we see again from the ethnographic record that in a second phase, after colonization of a new landscape, people begin to mark the landscape physically, for instance, by rock art. And again, these rock art images are often in association to narratives. So you are increasingly enculturating the landscape by telling stories about it and by beginning to mark the landscape with rock art. And some of this information comes from comparisons with the publication by Lois and Whalen, published in 2016. What is also characteristic of this early phase is that the motifs are very often placed on these open, near vertical rock art faces. And again, since this was the early colonization, it was just after the last ice age, there was no really trees here. So it was a very open landscape. There were no tall trees, very low vegetation that didn't hide the view of the rock art sites from you. And we also have to take into consideration that these rock art sites, the motifs, would have been more visible when they were made 8,000 to 10,000 years ago than they are today, where weathering and water and what have you have made them perhaps slightly less visible. So again, somewhat similar to what Wenke was talking about, I think these early rock art sites would have been very visible from a distance. They're on these vertical cliff sides. You have very large motifs, and if you see this image here to the bottom right, this is an image that Jan Magne actually took from a helicopter. So he was in a helicopter at the height above the sea level, where the sea level would have been at the time, and demonstrating that you can actually see the images from very far away. And I think when we talked yesterday, Jan Magne, he was saying that there seems to be that you can actually see the sites and motifs from maybe up to 500 meters away. So again, suggesting these would be very good wayfinding points, easy to navigate with in the landscape and cultivating the landscape from a distance. In addition, we might also see that hunter-gatherer rock art is not just about wayfinding, it is also about a cosmological landscape, about an understanding how people were living in the landscape. And we see that very often it is about how the animals seems to be emerging out of the rock, emerging in the landscape. And some of these sites are found at very narrow points where there would have been a great flood, where we know that this site here is where there's a lot of reindeer crossing today. It's one of the few places where the reindeer will cross. So people coming into this landscape, seeing this very narrow channel, might have had an experience of the reindeer actually coming from the inland through this narrow channel into the landscape. So that what we might have an indication of here is also that even the cosmological presentation is perceived at this sort of life-sized macro scale level. So if we try to sum up here, we can see that the places of the early Holocene rock art and the images is probably related to enculturation of the landscape. We know that there's colonization, extensive mobility. It's related to wayfinding through these prominent natural landscape features. It's linked later to narratives and then marking the landscape so that it becomes a closer integration between narratives and landscape as the landscape is increasingly revisited. And perhaps also a incorporation of this macro landscape features and experiences with a cosmological understanding. Moving into the mid-Holocene, we can see that there is a marked population increase, probably in the 5th millennium BC. We can see this from some calculation that has been done into demography. We also see that the dwellings that people were living in are becoming more substantial. They're probably now turf houses. There's more timber used, things that suggest that people were living for longer periods at a time in these dwellings. We know that the resources in the area were more stable, more predictable, so people could stay for longer times closer to the same resources. And we also see that where in the early Holocene, it was the same type of material culture over large distances. Now it's become more regional, so regionalization in material and technology, which again suggests that we are now dealing with a semi-sedentary organization and settlement system with a much more emphasis on regional mobility rather than long-distance mobility. When we look at the mid-Holocene rock art landscapes, we see that the sites are no longer placed in these very spectacular natural features. So, you know, it's a beautiful landscape, but they're not perhaps so spectacularly placed. So this is from UNESCO site at Alta in northern Norway, and where I've tried to bring in some of the most larger panels and areas. And you can see they would not have been very visible. They don't stand out as sort of a particular landscape features at a macro scale at this period. Similarly, we see that a number of sites have these boulders that would have been placed in the tidal zone. You have to remember that the sea level would have been higher at this point in time. So, as demonstrated also by Jan Magne previously, probably many of the boulders, when the rock art was made on them, was located in the tidal zone, so that twice a day the water would rise and these boulders would almost look like tiny miniature islands in the water near the beach. And we can see that what is really prominent here is that many of the places where we find the rock art is now perhaps linked to micro landscape and to environmental forces. So we see it's often close to water. In one of these cases here in Sweden, you see that the water is even covering some of the rock art. There is the example here that Hedlund showed with images on this rock that looks like the Northern Lights. And people have been using the microtopography so that in the bottom right corner, you see this round thing, and you have paw prints of a bear coming out within. So people have been using this natural little feature on the rock surface to demonstrate a bear den, where it's been hibernating, and then how it's leaving the den in the springtime, moving out of that. So they're again using that micro-landscape. So these mid-Holocene rock art sites are not really linked to major landscape features. It's not really visible from any sort of long distances, neither the location or the motif, because the motifs are on these more horizontal, so you have to be quite close in order to be able to see them. So it's more micro scale in how the rock surface is employed, and also in the topographical location. And interestingly, you can see also how this sort of general chronological development from the early to mid-Holocene is something that we begin to see even in the earlier tradition. So that if you see this area, all of the blue dots mark some of the earliest early Holocene sites, which are very marked, whereas the later ones are further into the landscape. They're not as visible out there. You might want to know where they are. They're not on quite so prominent natural landscape features. They are perhaps again more beginning to mark good entrance points for going ashore or for going inland for hunting, for instance. So there does seem to be that general development, even while you still have the larger motifs. And in fact, some of these later sites, we also see that these are some of the panels where you have both traditions represented. So you have some of these early life-size images, but you also have the later small schematized images. So again, what we think might be happening here in mid-Holocene is that you're beginning to internalize that regionalization. You're inhabiting that regional landscape, you're getting to know that really well, you're spending a lot of time in that regional and local landscape, and therefore you don't need to mark your wayfinding, and your marking of the landscape does not have to be at that macro scale, but you're looking at much more subtle way markers and indication, and you can focus on experiencing the cosmology also at a micro scale and a macro scale landscape. So really what is happening here from the early to the mid-Holocene is that living in the landscape is downscaled from that vast landscape with long distance mobility and the need for visual markers to a much more regional and local landscape where markers are more subtle. And we see this as very clearly linked to an initial small population with long distance mobility, to a mid-Holocene population increase that led to this semi-sedentary lifestyle, and hence also a focus on more limited geographical region that people will know in a much greater detail. And this downscaling also represents much more intimate knowledge of the landscape and less need for these micro-scale, easily identifiable and highly visible anchor points. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Tim Carver, who is going to present digitally.
I'm sorry.
Distinguished colleagues,
I'm
very happy to present some ideas on the rock art landscape at
we cannot hear you.
Sudan, here at the Valcamonica Rock Art Symposium. The Wadi Abdon is situated in the central Bayuda region in northern Sudan. During the archaeological survey project Wadi Abdon Itinerary, altogether over 8,300 archaeological sites were documented along the banks of the Wadi and its immediate hinterland. Among the discovered archaeological features are 217 rock art panels. Their distribution patterns are rather inhomogeneous, indicating their direct connection with different cultural, historical landscape elements and archaeological sites. This paper will focus on rock sites of different periods, prehistoric, ancient, and medieval, entangled with micro-oasis of Belum, which is currently subject to comprehensive landscape archaeological investigations. The paper will show the different spatial distribution patterns of rock art motifs and their spatial correlation, as well as functional visualization with different land use strategies developing diachronically in and around the oasis of Belum and its immediate different rock art categories in regard of the date as well as motifs correlate with specific concepts of rangeland economies, forming a differentiated and integrated land and water resources management, closely entangling intensified oasis agriculture with pastoral production strategies, making use of unarable rangelands. Rock art depictions of different livestock associated with short and middle range pastoral or non-pastoral mobility can be interpreted chronologically and functionally. The aim of this paper is to demonstrate the potential of rock art analysis for the general reconstruction of this subsistence and land use strategies in terms of spatial and landscape archaeology. This was mainly done with GIS-based kernel density estimation. For general spatial distribution patterns analysis, covering the whole spatial cells of 5,000 by 5,000 meters. For more detailed investigations of smaller areas of interest, like the immediate vicinity of the oasis of Elun, archaeological feature density was estimated in spatial cells of 350 by 350 meter till 750 by 750 meters. For indicating different relations of production in the archaeological record, it is assumed that indicators of social mobility can be correlated with pastoral production strategies, while indicators of sedentarism relate to agri and horticultural production as major sources of statistics. Multi-room stone constructions and granite-shaped clusters of brown huts are estimated as indicators of sedentarism, while campsites and solitary open shelters are interpreted as temporary installations and therefore indications for mobility.
Just for a moment.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to present some ideas on the rock art landscape at around the Oasis of Northern Sudan, here in the Valcamonica Rock Art Symposium. The Valcamonica project is created in the central Valcamonica of Northern Sudan. During the archaeological survey project of Valcamonica, altogether over 8,300 archaeological sites, the documented along the length of the valley. Among the discovered archaeological features are 270 rock art panels. Their distribution patterns are rather homogeneous, indicating their direct connection with different cultural, historical, and scientific elements and archaeological sites. This paper, the photos of rock sites of different periods, prehistoric, and handled with micro-oasis of Elun, which is currently subject to comprehensive landscape archaeological investigations. The paper shows different spatial distribution patterns of rock art motifs and their spatial correlation as well as functional contextualization with different land use strategies developing the economical and around the base of Elun and its strategic plan. Different rock art categories regard the date as well as motifs, correlate with the typical set of arrangement economies, forming a differentiated and integrated model of land water resource management, closely resembling intensified oasis area and horticulture, with based on pastoral production strategies, making use of unparalleled ratios. Rock art pictures of different livestock, short, can be implemented chronologically and functionally. Aiming the paper to demonstrate the potential of rock art analysis for the general reconstruction of these systems and land strategies in terms of spatial and landscape archaeology. Analysis of spatial clustering patterns is mainly done with GIS-based kernel density estimation. The general spatial distribution patterns analysis covering the overall spatial cells of 5,000 by 5,000 meters still 700 by 700. For indicating different relations of production, the archaeological record is assumed that indicators of social mobility can be correlated with pastoral production strategies, while indicators of settlement related agri and agricultural production as major source of subsistence. Multi-groups of constructions and large-shaped clusters of round huts are estimated as indicators of settlement, while campsites and solitary open shelters are interpreted as temporary installations and therefore indications of mobility. One major flaw data acquired with the archaeological surveys that surveys only minor parts of the documented archaeological records clearly dated. In some cases, datable surface finds are clearly related to organic installations. In few cases, test samples reveal organic material capable of radiocarbonate. Most of the stated material indicates the peak of human activity in the lower body of the local late activity, which means the local chronology is the late Neolithic and post-Neolithic period, as well as the Middle Ages, the Christian period, as an early Islamic and Jewish period. In some parts of the lower body of the local, comparatively stable cultural landscapes can be reconstructed over longer time spans from that local record. While in other parts, especially at the fringe towards the middle body of the world, a fluctuating cultural landscape with regular shifts between agricultural and pastoral relations of production has to be considered. Some of the rock art documented in the lower body of the world correlates with rough dating estimations in this process. Other Christian symbols obviously came to the Christian by the dating camel depictions in the same period corresponds to the general assumption that the introduction of animals or gardens, despite the reference to the animal of South Africa, took place at the fringe between late antiquity and the early period. Besides these few chronological evidences, the general still rather few chronology of the majority of the archaeological record along the Bali alone causes some difficulties which hopefully clarified by intensifying research. Nevertheless, the recognizable spatial patterns in different categories of archaeological record lie in the usual structural patterns. For estimating stable or fluctuating land use strategies on a long-term basis, multispectral satellite data and contact view statistical evidence from the archaeological record of use. The correlation between the development of publication schemes and well stating at least from the medieval period of investigative research shown as a part of the oasis around settlement or lane. As a comparable stable land use character over the periods, while the eastern part of the rain and work, the action of the range and the middle part of the world has to be interpreted as a fluctuating cultural landscape. Analysis of the development of land patterns, especially irrigation schemes and national base work, was carried out using raster data cluster analysis using Atlas management software provided by the Informatics of the University of Windsor, based on the standardized normalized vegetation index. The majority of rock sites, both by 151 levels, situated in the lower part of the dome around the races of the new facade. The predominant motive categories consist of depictions of cattle, camels, human beings, crosses, and geometric motifs. Most elaborate abstract geometric rock forms concentrate at the narrow passage along the tributary core. This rock art station most probably dates back to the Neolithic period. Since there are no indications that the role of the rest of the Asali as ecological equal zones date back into this time, this specific rock art station is not further integrated into the analysis. This data is based upon. Cattle locations are predominantly one or altogether 25 panels found on one single rock at the southern bank terrace of the Valcamonica, downstream west of Kasai. Other four rock panels depicting cattle are situated in its immediate vicinity. The cattle depictions are of some stylistic variety. All of them are made with pack technique, but some are only indicated by an outline, as before, while others cover the whole area of the depiction with paintings, as in this example. Cattle depictions are more widespread in the whole Valcamonica, but also concentrate predominantly in the lower. Most cattle depictions are found on pathways leading from Valcamonica southwards to Valcamonica. Depictions of crosses and other Christian motifs, giving short descriptions, are distributed in two different ways along the lower Valcamonica. First, these Christian religious symbols are concentrated around the monastery of Kasai, obviously collected as a specific religious landscape defined by this monastery. This includes a small shelter and some distance from the monastery, most probably the habitation site of an anchorage dependent to the monastic organization. Besides these concentrations of Christian rock art motifs being connected to monastic life in Kasai, another elaboration of cross depictions and some other Christian motifs, but without any accompanying inscriptions, is found south of the oasis. Closely connected with camera depictions are rock drawings of human beings. Many of them all integrated scenes with camels, human beings are depicting standing or riding the camels. But solitary depictions of human beings are also, in many cases, closely related to camel depictions. Other depictions like giraffes, dogs, boats, or sandal prints are found only singularly with the rock art models of the Valcamonica. They can be compared to similar with other regions, but their low distribution over the study area makes it inappropriate to incorporate them into a quantitative analysis. Especially the depictions of camels and cattle, typical livestock associated with pastoral production of animals, seems to imply that rock art is part of the Sudan, was primarily an artistic statement of mobile and pastoral solutions. The spatial distribution patterns of rock art animals, however, seem to contradict this assumption to some extent. During the survey of Valcamonica, different archaeological features indicating either sedentary agricultural or mobile pastoral relations of production turned out to be clearly differentiated from each other. Temporary camp structures and long-term sedentary vegetation sites, covering station belts, irrigation schemes, or natural waste. Spatial distribution patterns of all archaeological indicators define land for mobility and land for settlement in and around Valcamonica. Compared to the distribution patterns of rock art depictions, the allocation of typical pastoral motifs like livestock to mobility indicators in the archaeological record could be expected. But when analyzing the data, however, it turns out that such an anticipated spatial allocation cannot be observed. On the contrary, many parts of the Valcamonica or cars, surprisingly, especially motifs with pastoral connotations like cattle and camels, are spatially correlated to archaeological indications of sedentary agricultural relations of production. When spatially comparing the distribution of rock art and the whole of the Valcamonica, patterns of mobility and sedentarism to the archaeological record in general, it is obvious that the lower Valcamonica in the west of the Kasai is dominated by sedentary indicators, indicated red, while the middle and upper Valcamonica are dominated by the habitability indicators, indicated blue, only some few regional clusters of archaeological features indicating settled tourism. Rock art clusters are, however, predominantly found in the lower valley, only one single larger cluster, and the upper valley south of Jerusalem. Interestingly, not far away from the small cluster of permanent vegetation sites dating to the Biblical period. Also, when focusing on the lower valley oasis, no spatial correlation between rock art clusters and small scale density kernels of archaeological utility indicators are visible. Indeed, rock art clusters are rather found in spatial context with specific art networks, and the course of the main body itself. Remarkably, the vast majority of rock art in the lower valley is found between the oasis of Asali and the western part of the oasis, where irrigation was more stable on a longer basis than the eastern part of the oasis. Additionally, the fact that the vast majority, which means 97% of rock art in the lower valley are found in the southern part of the oasis in the land. Areas north of the main margin are almost empty of rock. When looking at different categories of rock art, specific spatial distribution patterns become more obvious. First of all, the concentration of almost all categorizations or at least around one single spot of stones. This spot is not directly associated with the rest of Asali, but situated west of it, 30 kilometers away from the line. Categorizations This is true on short range as well as the middle range level. When looking at the course of the valley of the world as a whole, it turns out that most rock art is concentrated in the lower valley of the oasis, and declines rapidly in the middle and upper valley, which was in both periods dominated by pastoral relations of production. On the short range level, when analyzing density kernels of mobility indicators on the basis of the 750 by 750 meter space itself, and to compare them to clusters of rock art, also no direct alignment can be stated for the lower valley of the world in particular. Interestingly, especially categorizations do not correspond at all. Not only with general archaeological indicators of mobility, but also with archaeologically testified evidence of cattle keeping. In the Pastoral Society of Lake, we could see in the upper valley alone, cattle keeping and beef consumption, at least by local belief, can be derived from archaeological material from the lead settlement complex of the Lithuania. This pastoral cattle keeping system constructed from the archaeological record does not correspond to any categorizations in rock art in this part of the valley. On the contrary, the only categorizations in the valley of the Rhone indicate yellow are neither aligned with the zone of pastoral economy nor with the wet landscape of the valley of the Rhone itself, but exclusively close to the valley out into the Nile. This direct connection with the region of the zone might indicate that the very socio-economically connected to the river zone. Concerning cattle locations, indicate orange. We could also use the alignment of density curves of cattle drawings with the location of human beings, indicated blue, as well as the motives, indicated green. All these rock rays are neither spatially aligned and archaeological indications of natural mobility, nor with areas of natural pasture used from the spatial satellite imagery analysis, as indicated here by this color. Interestingly, the only major category of archaeological landscape data spatially collected is showing cluster of artificial panels, human figures, and Christian symbols are part of this. These outposts from the waves of the lower body of Angola. The rock art clusters are situated near some passages to a rocky ridge, limiting the immediate of the body next to the south. Other clusters of rock art depicting rich motives and motifs are closely connected to the monastery of Vasari, which can be seen to be buried and explained of high-level basic culture and not closely connected to the religious side of the indigenous inhabitants of the Valley of Rome, the religions general. The spatial distribution balance of different categories of rock art of the Valley of Rome, therefore, does not indicate close entanglement of the statistic genre, the socio-economic balance of the inhabitants of the valley west of the Loire, all the historical of the middle and upper Valley of Rome. Cattle depictions are exclusively found in the river plantation zone, downstream of the oasis of the lower Valley of Rome. This might indicate that these cattle depictions were not created by the inhabitants, but by nile-based herders who drove cattle short range level upwards from the cultivated land strip along the river banks in order to make use of the natural nature of the immediate of the river. Socio-economic relations with the indigenous Valcamonica remain unclear, further blurred by the determined names of applications. Cattle locations and directly associated drawings of human beings and Christian motives are commonly aligned with the art-day names rather than archaeological festival indicators or areas of periodic natural pasture. The reality of these art days might indicate their own lineage or variation, but network-shaped art remains closely associated with the kernels of archaeological features, so periodic natural pasture, are connected to short-range local communications. The silent motives of some of the cattle depictions indicate dividers and hard tables, further indicate the connection of these rock art stations with the range of location balance, rather than as the pastoral or semi-pastoral transhuman lifestyle of the local inhabitants. Finally, other clusters of Christian motives and depictions of human beings associated with Christians are connected to the specific full landscape around the monastery of Vasari, especially along the center and the religious satellite sites, for example, about also in this case, some connections to external cultural influences of the Valley of the Rome like first, because of general indications that most family monastery of Vasari came from outside of religious dwellers, and second, because of the presence of Christian rock inscriptions on the rock art station only in the vicinity of the monastery, while other parts of the valley inscriptions on rock or other material are active completely in the archaeological record, indicating that the local indigenous population was largely different. In all these cases, the spatial distribution balance of art on the external sources, also giving an explanation for statistic similarities between rock forms in the Valley of the Rome and other rock art stations in some distance. Rock art in general does not seem to be an artistic expression of the indigenous natives of the Valley of the Rome in Central America, but produced by outsiders. Thank you very much for your attention.
Then the last one is the Maria. Yeah. Sharing the screen now.
See you online.
Okay, then I think we are ready to start.
We are just waiting for Daniel to share his screen, so just have a bit of patience. US organizers decided to break now. Yeah, we can take the date and wait and see if it comes. Charlotte.
Can you hear us, Daniel? You can see your screen if you can't hear.
¿Y eso?
Are you there, Daniel?
Yes, we will do that. We will do that.
Okay, we can see your presentation, then we can't hear. Do you have your microphone?
We'll run the debate while you try to get it. Hello, everybody. We will try to have a short debate. Only one of the presenters are available on this session, but I hope you have a few questions for Charlotte. And then we will wait to see if we can connect with the last speaker, but there is some technical problems. So if anybody has questions to the presentation by Dan, I would appreciate it.
Do I understand correctly that there is no way to ask questions to the next lecturer?
We don't know if we can connect with him yet. So if we can't connect with him to do his presentation, it is hard to ask questions to the presentation.
I sort of asking him if the lecture was about rock art.
Yes.
So why didn't he show any?
I think he's asking the question to Tim for this one.
Not for the last one, he will not be there. That was a video presentation. He will not be there. Yes. Then I suggest you go to the leaflet and all the email addresses are there. But it's hard when he's not available. So I understand your does anybody have questions for Charlotte Dam?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
There are many animals that you showed. There are many more. What are they? Why did people invent animals? What did they stand for?
Well, I mean, give me. Working? Yeah. Well, that's always the question, and I don't have any good answer for that. My concern has, in my research in rock art, I've not been so much concerned with interpreting the individual images, but I've been more concerned with trying to understand placements in the landscape, diversity in locations, perhaps diversity in techniques. So obviously there will be, as Jan Magne showed, there will be some areas where the animals on the rock art is closely related also to what people were hunting, whereas in the area that I presented on, while I'm sure that there are concrete scenes of people hunting both bear and reindeer and elk, we also know that this is not what was the main subsistence economy. So I think that the hunting of reindeer and elk, of course, they ate the meat, but it was probably it was used, seals and fishing. So that means that that in those areas, the focus on large terrestrial mammals, in my opinion, was probably much more related also to wider narratives. Of course, the importance of hunting these animals, but I think it is also linked to some life world perspectives, cosmology, what have you. Possibly something that is linked to areas where the hunting of these animals was perhaps more important, and where you see a more wider, perhaps coherent cosmology, which is still living on in the northern regions, even though the subsistence there is perhaps focusing on.
Do you mind if I met you right now?
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, can I ask you to ask the question near the camera?
Yeah.
So can you stand up?
But I can repeat that the question.
Okay, my first question was, what are these animals? Why people invade animals, not only in Scandinavia, but in many other places? The main answer was that it was animals that they were hunting. It was a kind of economical aspect. No?
No, that was actually not what I was saying, but never mind. Go ahead.
Okay. In my own little experience, I saw quite many sites in Norway and Sweden, more than Sweden than Norway.
Hola.
So always animals. I saw only quite few sense of hunting.
Hola.
That there was
¿Me escuchan?
Daniel, sí, ¿nos entiendes?
Sí, ahora sí. Es un gusto estar con ustedes en esta ocasión y poder compartir.
Nuestro gusto. Si puedes esperar un segundo, estamos en una sección de debate porque no te entendimos. En un minuto volvimos a ti. Estás, no cambies nada. Está,
Ok.
Deja todo así como está ahora. Gracias. Un minuto. Sorry.
Okay. My own impression is that hunting took little room in the whole world of folk art in Scandinavia and also in other places. So, did the animals symbolize something or what?
Okay. Also, sorry, you for answering. This is one.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I see your point that although there are hunting scenes, and the majority of the images that you see also in the Scandinavian rock art are not hunting scenes, but they are depictions of animals. And as I tried to say in my first answer, I think we can say that people were hunting these animals. I also think, particularly for the area that I presented on, this was not the main subsistence part, and therefore I would agree, as you were presenting yesterday, that they are linked into a wider understanding of the life world, possibly also cosmological understanding. To what extent this really covers everywhere is hard to say. I think one has to bear in mind that in many of these northern circumpolar regions, large terrestrial animals are actually a very important resource, and therefore I'm a little worried about saying that it's the same all over the world. I think one has to take into consideration that there are differences regionally in why you portray certain animals.
Is there any other questions now? But otherwise, we will show the last presentation, and then we will, after that, just open up briefly for a question from the last talk, if somebody has it.
Ok, Daniel, ese es tu momento.
Bien. Es un gusto poder estar con ustedes y poder compartir esta ponencia sobre arte rupestre, medio ambiente y paisaje cultural en el departamento de Amazonas, Perú. Un estudio del caso de los grabados rupestres de Carachupa. A partir de...
Daniel, puedes poner el PowerPoint en modalidad como full screen, como más grande, si sabes cómo hacer. Hay un abajo, bueno, abajo, sí, esto, perfecto.
Ya. Bien, a partir del año 2018, iniciamos un inventario general de los sitios de arte rupestre del departamento de Amazonas, y para tal fin, nosotros consensuamos una metodología de la investigación holística que abarca tanto en el espacio natural como el paisaje cultural. Carachupa, en su contexto de los sitios registrados y documentados, presentamos el caso del sitio grabado denominado Carachupa, porque su ubicación, construcción y acceso restringido, así como la acústica y excepcional percepción y simbolización del espacio ecorregional y el paisaje cultural, sin lugar a dudas, confirman un mejor punto de partida para dar a conocer el arte rupestre en el departamento de Amazonas. El sitio se encuentra, tiene un panorama excepcional en cuanto al medio natural, destacando el Cerro Cualco, el cual se encuentra frente, considerado como un espacio sagrado, conocido por la gran cantidad de abrigos con pinturas rupestres que alberga este lugar. Sin embargo, Carachupa está ubicado en la cima de una elevación en la cual destaca una saliente de roca sedimentaria que conforma un abrigo rocoso en el sector inferior y que mide 3,10 metros de largo por 1,80 de ancho. Hay una sucesión de rocas que señalan la entrada, que es angosta y está orientada al norte. El soporte con arte rupestre está orientado al este, y en este estrecho pasillo y bloques de piedra a modo de mesa lo separa un espacio de menor altura. Un lugar, a dudas, se empleó como un espacio de descanso y de albergue. El sitio no presenta testimonios culturales en superficie. Y aquí lo podemos ver, el ingreso, la gran roca sobre la superficie, los soportes plasmados, es una vista general del soporte y los grabados rupestres. Puede observarse tanto un sector del medio ambiente que fue percibido, simbolizado y representado como un paisaje cultural, plasmado con un conjunto de imágenes relativas a grupos de descendencia o linaje, los cuales marcaron el territorio, sociedades que establecieron límites y relaciones de poder, existiendo en el lugar de origen, residencia, unión o uso efectivo de los recursos naturales. El sistema representado exhibe una perspectiva local y regional que muestra un grupo de humanos que coexistieron, convergieron e interactuaron. Constituye un corpus de información significativa que empleamos en la construcción de la memoria de las sociedades que habitaron el distrito de Loña Grande y áreas vecinas. Tal como lo vemos, la imagen ha sido procesada a través del programa de X-Ray Mesh para poder visualizar mejor los grabados. A ver, sigamos. Aquí los detalles de dichas representaciones y la unión de algunos elementos figurativos a la cual nosotros estamos identificando en el proceso de investigación. Aquí de igual manera los espacios de cómo se han trabajado y también de la denominación de Carachupa. Vemos que hay espacios lineales y que tienen cierta curvatura a la cual estamos identificando como serpientes. Los detalles de la presencia de manos, otros detalles en la cual es notorio el regrabado en superficie y la patina que también nos deja observar. Aquí también la presencia de manos y cómo se ha estructurado el diseño para poder ver pequeños hoyuelos dispuestos entre los espacios a lo que nosotros estamos identificando como serpientes y por ende como elementos relacionados al agua. Sin embargo, las representaciones de Cerro Corupuna integran la cordillera central y el corredor montañoso Vilaya, Condorpuna, Chipago, cobran importancia en este estudio al considerar que divide las cuencas hidrográficas de los ríos Utcubamba y Marañón, y es porque son cabeceras de cuenca de varias quebradas que proveen agua y espacio regional. La imagen del cerro se semeja a la cabeza de una serpiente, y está diseñada por su consecuencia con cúpulas dispuestas alrededor que la forman, en forma sempertiforme e elipsoide, que también integra el tallado de varias cúpulas y alude a la zona pantanosa que se ubica en la cima. Además, en el sistema plasmado incluyeron la figura de 3 ríos sempertiformes con cabezas triangulares que atraviesan cuesta abajo el terreno y destacan por crear y destruir sectores del mismo, generando sectores insulares, conexiones o pasajes que también muestran en este conjunto de grabados que han sido procesados en Carachupa. Aquí una vista general de cómo están dispuestas la presencia de las cúpulas pequeñas y el nudo que une a las serpientes, a la cual nosotros, a través de los pueblos originarios, estamos recogiendo la información etnológica de este tipo de representaciones que también nos conllevan a poder determinar de qué se trata de serpientes. Sigamos. Quiero obedecer ahora. Ah, ya, listo. Aquí una vista mejor, a detalle, de los elementos que lo conforman. De igual manera, para ver las técnicas que confluyen y los surcos con los cuales se han plasmado, las manos, las diferentes manos colocadas y todos los espacios recurrentes y el nudo de las cabezas en los extremos que nos están indicando esa confluencia entre las serpientes que van en la parte baja, ¿no? Como les digo, el sitio de arte rupestre Carachupa presenta una conformación natural de excelencia para la función que revistió en la antigüedad. Buena acústica, constituye un espacio sagrado destinado a actividades netamente rituales, que por las condiciones del lugar fueron de acceso socialmente restringido a líderes comunitarios y chamanes. El petroglifo plasmaron una construcción simbólica singular. Exhibe un discurso visual y narrativo que hunde sus raíces en los procesos cognitivos o la forma en que sucesivos grupos sociales percibieron y conceptualizaron el espacio natural y el paisaje cultural según la ideología, cosmovisión dominante de ese momento cronológico a la cual estamos atribuyendo. En síntesis, concibieron que el área, la primera representación conocida por un sistema de relaciones espaciales. De hecho, que al integrar las representaciones de manos y pies en relación con las serpientes, cursos de agua, expresaron una construcción social del paisaje, simbolizando la aprehensión, efectividad del territorio por parte de uno o más grupos de descendencia, linaje, señalando el lugar de origen, pertenencia, vínculo, asentamiento y aprovechamiento de los recursos naturales. Por otra parte, es notable que la percepción del movimiento esté limitada a la secuencia de cúpulas y la red hídrica que circulan las energías e información que unían a los grupos de descendencia. Quizás pertenecían a un mismo linaje. Las dinámicas sociales pueden apreciarse en la superposición o adición de motivos, diseño original y la variabilidad estilística que construye una perspectiva ligeramente diacrónica que confirma la perduración temporal del sistema de creencias en la cual concibió al nudo de las serpientes como un río en la posición central del sistema, representado como un afianzamiento de la producción grupal. Además, es interesante observar los sectores insulares generados por la red mencionada que construyen un eje de sistema representado. Y todo ello nos conlleva pues, a poder tener algunos elementos identificados dentro de esa simbología que se plasmaron. Algo que quisiera acotar es la investigadora Hockenbeck, basados en la información etnológica de ceja y selva, al referirse a la relación entre los ancestros míticos y las serpientes, sostiene que el agua que corre y forma un río, el agua ligada con el dueño del trueno, es una serpiente, al igual que el relámpago, el arco iris y la sustancia vital de los ancestros. Es el agua de vida, de regeneración y de serpientes, un animal que se transforma sin totalidad. Esta autora sostiene que la existencia de una relación entre los objetos alargados y los ancestros míticos, los objetos delgados, largos, que rodean, delimitan, juntan, unen y un poquito de agua, se me secó la garganta, y que por su forma son considerados serpientes que se asemejan a los ancestros fundadores del linaje, que definen sus descendientes y los reúnen en una sola comunidad, única por lazos de parentesco. y destaca que estos objetos intervienen en todos los ritos que establecen, refuerzan y reafirman la comunidad, permitiendo su reproducción a nivel ideológico, y que esto ocurre en la estación húmeda, cuando el agua asegura la reproducción de estas sociedades a nivel material. En síntesis, el petroglifo de Carachupa exhibe un medio sumamente interesante respecto al ambiente simbolizado, ¿no? Como hemos visto a través de las imágenes que lo estamos observando en este momento, denotan pues una etnicidad, una pertenencia de territorio y una cosmovisión dominante que John Kember explica en base a la información histórica. Desde ya quedamos muy agradecidos aquí el equipo de trabajo en una de las zonas de Selva Alta en el Perú, identificando algunos de los promontorios rocosos en esta parte de Selva Alta en el Perú y muy en la margen izquierda del río Marañón. Gracias.
Gracias, Daniel. Muy bueno, muy apreciado.
We open up then for a short debate for questions. If anybody has questions for Daniel.
No lo entendí. Susana, por favor, ¿puedes ayudarme con el idioma?
No hay problema, no hay problema. Si hay preguntas en la sala, parece que todo estaba muy claro y bien explicado. Parece que no hay cuestiones. Déjame ver si hay algo que llega del internet. No, del internet también está todo claro.
Then there's no questions now there too. So I think we then will close the session. Thank you to everybody that has presented. Very good. And I hope to see you later in the conference. And thank you for everybody attending the session on behalf of me and Adrian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alguien preguntaba que si había pueblos originarios en Amazonas. Sí, tenemos dos naciones originarias, el pueblo Ahuajún y los pueblos Huampis, que se encuentran en línea de frontera cerca al Ecuador, y en la cual no se ha hecho ninguna investigación arqueológica. En estas áreas como Río Santiago, Río Cenepa, no hay ninguna investigación arqueológica, y es factible que este 5 al 12 de noviembre esté visitando dos comunidades para poder ver algunas pinturas rupestres en la zona.
Somos muy curiosos de saber lo que se va a pasar en esta región. Un segundo. Bien, espera un segundo, hay una pregunta por ti. Chat 1. En chat. Marisa Giorgi pregunta, te dice, gracias por la gran presentación, y la pregunta es, ¿hay pueblos indígenas que se identifiquen hoy con estas imágenes?
No. Hay pueblos originarios que han perdido el rastro de la simbología. Tanto así que nosotros hemos viajado a Ucayali, la selva central, para poder reafirmar algunos elementos con 18 naciones, en la cual, por ejemplo, el cuadrado y los extremos con cabezas de serpientes aún delineadas, aún cuando están sistematizadas, nos están dando ese elemento de identidad que lo han perdido los pueblos que se ubican en la costa, que diré en la Amazonía de la línea de frontera entre Perú y Ecuador. Y es en razón a que hay dos ríos que lo unen, el Marañón y el Guayaga, que la única vía de accesibilidad a estos pueblos era a través de estos ríos, pero que aun cuando ellos reproducen algunos elementos, no lo identifican como el agua, sino lo identifican a un elemento como es el pez, por ejemplo, ¿no? Y ellos lo identifican como si fuera el pez, pero yendo a otros pueblos más al sur, nos permiten reafirmar lo que venimos sosteniendo de las fuentes de agua y de la generalización del espacio y del reconocimiento que los pueblos prehispánicos aseveraron en su medio. Sin embargo, las naciones actuales han perdido ya todo ese cordón umbilical simbólico que sí se requieren mayores estudios. Estamos teniendo acercamientos con ellos porque realmente algunos están totalmente nulos del conocimiento nuestro, desconocen ellos, pero como universidad sí no, es factible el acceso de poder llegar a estas comunidades. Gracias, Marixa Georgi. Un gusto saludarte.
Muchas gracias. Marisa Giorgi te dice gracias por esta respuesta muy completa y muy generosa. Entonces, gracias. Déjanos saber lo que se pasará en el futuro con estas investigaciones. ¿Ok, Daniel?
Gracias, gracias.
Chao, chao, hasta la próxima. Chao, Daniel.
Chao, chao.